Hey, how's it going? So I just wanted to talk a moment about something that's kind of interested me for a little bit, the differences and the similarities between Stoicism and Platonism or Platonic philosophy. There's a lot of similarities to both of them, and there's a lot of differences to both. Specifically, Platonic philosophy seems more up in the air. So it's more head in the clouds, very theoretical. It had the whole idea of the ultimate ideal, the ultimate idea, the ultimate thought. Socrates or Plato talks about the idea of beauty, the ultimate good of life, which is the ideal of life, right? Which is the ultimate ideal that we all strive for, that we can envision in our heads, but we can't necessarily manifest in our physical reality yet. And there's many examples of this ultimate idea of beauty and good that Socrates or Plato talks about. One specific example is in Plato's Republic, where he talks about the ideal form of government allows for maximum liberty, but also that also works the maximum virtue. And that was another thing that Platonic philosophy was big about, was working in virtue, right? Working a life of virtue. How virtue brings happiness, right? Goodness brings happiness, and vice brings unhappiness. So that was Platonic philosophy, in a nutshell, is the ultimate good, right? The ultimate idea, the ultimate thought, which everything comes from in this earth. Because we know this. Everything originates with a thought. Right. That's one of those kind of philosophical things that a lot of people agree with. It was everything around you that you can see started with a thought, some sort of thought. Somebody had an idea of, okay, I want to build a table, or I want to build a computer or something, right? And so they think about it, they write it out on a diagram, plan it out, and then build it. And then here it is in front of you. So everything that you see in life starts with a thought. Plato's idea was it goes a little bit further than our thoughts, right? It can start with every thought that we have comes from somewhere. So our thoughts kind of agrees with Rene Descartes here, about 2,000 years later, when he says, what was the source of my thinking, right? I'm a thinking thing. I think, therefore I am. But what was the source of my thinking? What causes my thoughts? That was Rene Descartes. Plato, he seems to agree with the Platonic viewpoint there of our thoughts don't just pop in our head, they come from somewhere. There's a source. And Plato basically had the idea that our thoughts come from the divine realms, right? They don't originate with us. We grab them or borrow from those divine thoughts and then manifest it in our physical reality. So that's Platonism, right? So Platonism is very up in the clouds. It's very up. It's kind of more of a universal philosophy. And he had a lot of other viewpoints as well, specifically talking about virtue. I mentioned that, and how to treat others and things like that, and how to govern and, all those kind of things. But Plato was very poetic, very, I guess you would say verbose, right? He was, explain things in a very poetic and verbose way. These very deep, abstract concepts, and that's what I like about Plato, is because it allows, for higher thought, right? Whereas Stoicism is much more grounded on the earth, right? It's how do I deal with my personal struggles? Don't let outside events get to you. Only worry, if you can't control it, right? You can't control this. You can't impact it, right? It's going to happen anyway, right? The fates have ordained that it happens. God has ordained that it happens. So it's going to happen, right? A natural disaster happens, or some sort of other tragedy happens. That was just meant to happen. There was nothing we can do about it. There's no way we can change that event. So we work on what we can control, which is our own thoughts, our own emotions, our own actions. And at all times, despite all circumstances, we do, to the best of our ability, try to do what we know is right. And so you can see the differences there. Plato's very high up in the clouds. Stoicism is, how do I deal with my personal struggles? How do I deal with the realities and the tragedies of life? There's a lot of similarities with, Seneca will specifically say virtue is the most important. You're not really a philosopher if you're not teaching virtue. So it's important to understand that. So and at first I find it interesting in the letters of a Stoic, right? From Seneca, he at first kind of, what I interpreted was mocking Plato, which I found offensive. Not really offensive, but I was just like, really, I love Plato. Don't talk about Plato that way. But he talks about how, Plato's too abstract. None of it deals with reality. None of this really matters. What Plato's talking about, what matters is, how do we live a good life here, right now, in reality. And then later on in those letters, Seneca, he's talking to his student Lucilius, who was also a philosopher of the day, but it was more or less his student, his Padawan, I guess you would say, in Star Wars terminology, his student. He's basically writing all these letters to Lucilius on how to deal and cope with life and things like that, right? And later on in those letters, after kind of mocking Plato's idea of philosophy, he kind of changes his mind. And he's like, you know what? Plato is good, right? The Platonic philosophy is actually good because it elevates your soul, right? We're all grounded here in this muck of a life, of an existence, right? But Plato can actually elevate your soul to the highest reaches of the heavens, right? To meet with the gods. I found that interesting how at first he mocked Plato, but then he ended up saying Plato's awesome, right? And he had a change of heart. And that's a mark of intelligence to me, is when somebody who has a certain belief, right, will change their mind about something with a little more reading, a little more research, and they realize, you know what, this isn't so bad after all. I actually agree with this. It's good to have this viewpoint. It actually helps my soul here. It's actually a good thing to talk about, the higher reaches of the heavens and the ultimate idea and things like that. But Stoicism, in a nutshell, deals with how to deal with the personal struggles, right? Whereas Platonic philosophy deals with the higher reaches of the heavens and the ultimate idea. And they both agree with each other on the practice of virtue. They believe virtue brings happiness. A virtuous life is where happiness is. And then they go on to define what virtue even is. And from what I can tell, reading Plato and the Stoics, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus specifically, I believe virtue it's a changeable thing. It's not necessarily, virtue isn't one thing, it's many things. You can have the virtue of courage, you can have the virtue of love, you can have the virtue of beauty, all these different virtues, right? That we can, even virtues that you're supposed to act, right? Temperance, patience, self-control, all these different virtues that are important in life to have a civil society. They're one and the same thing, yet they're all different. And so it's one of those things where I believe if you take an Aristotelian philosophy as well, virtue is an action of the soul, right? And I believe all the philosophers agree with this, from my understanding, is it's an action of the soul, which is different in each circumstance. At times, courage is important, in a conflict, but you're not going to be super brave in a moment that doesn't call for courage per se. And courage might actually be temperance, abstaining from something in a different situation, right? Or courage might be patient, being patient in a certain situation. It might change to patience depending on the circumstance, right? So virtue is an action of the soul, right, in any given circumstance. And if you practice virtue, it brings happiness, right? And various philosophers as well go on to say that, the best way to attain wisdom is by acting with virtue. And the easiest way, I believe Plato says this, the easiest way to get wisdom is through the virtue of kindness, okay? Being kind in every situation. Kindness seems kind of like a hack, right, so to speak. If you think about it, you want wisdom, then be kind, right? Because in most circumstances of life, we're not always called to be courageous, right? In war or a fight or anything like that, right? We're defending our family or whatever. Sometimes the most courageous action you can take in daily life is simply being kind to people you don't agree with, the people that get on your nerves, right? And it's one of the hardest things to do for a lot of people, right? I'll admit I've had a hard time being kind to various people in my life too that annoyed me. But since learning about Stoicism, a Platonic philosophy, and all these different philosophies that talk about virtue and kindness, right? I've made it my mission to be kind as much as I possibly can think about it in every circumstance. So it's interesting to see all the, various agreements in these different time periods of philosophy. Stoicism and Platonic philosophy, had about a 400-ish year gap, right? You have Plato around 400 BC, right? And then you had, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and all these guys around the 100 AD-ish mark, give or take 50-ish years. Despite that time gap, despite Platonic philosophy being Greek and Stoicism being Roman, right? And then, you had Neoplatonism in the Middle Ages, right? Despite those time gaps and cultures and circumstances all these various people were in, you have this agreement on the practice of virtue. So you had the disagreement on what was important to know about, right? Is the ultimate idea the most important thing to know about, since that's where everything comes from? Or is not letting outside events get to you, right? And only practicing virtue in any given circumstance, because that's what you can control as yourself, is that the most important thing? and they both come to the conclusion that virtue is the most important thing. So they both agree there. Just how they got to that conclusion was different. So I found that interesting. I love philosophy. If you can't tell, I'm pretty passionate about it. I could talk about it all day. My poor wife, she, I talk her ear off all the time about this stuff. So I got to have some sort of outlet. So that's why I'm on YouTube, right? Talking and on Instagram. So, if you like philosophy, feel free to like, subscribe, follow me on YouTube. And then, I'm on Instagram as well. Follow me. I post daily wisdom on that as well. But I plan on doing this consistently for, as long as humanly possible. So, I look forward to talking to you some more. I hope you all found this interesting. I'll see you around.